So Born to be Wild is an IMAX, Omnimax film that is essentially about two incredible ladies. Daphne Sheldrick is the elephant orphanage lady in Africa, and Baruti Galdikas raises orphaned orangutans in Borneo. And it's a story of these two ladies, how they raise up these orphans, and in the end, how they find a way to get these orphans back to the wild. So it's an inspiring story on a number of levels. These ladies are absolutely inspiring. They're both heroes to me. They're amazing people. But these animals are really, I think, inspiring as well. Like, these animals overcome all kinds of hardship and adversity and have some pretty happy lives, as you'll see in the film. Baruti Galdikas is a lady who grew up in Canada. She spent some of her time in Toronto. She actually spent a few years in Elliott Lake in Northern Ontario, and ended up in Vancouver at one point, and then eventually LA. But she went to Borneo when she was in university to start a PhD on orangutans, and she was one of the three ladies, they called Leakey's ladies, that Louis Leakey sent out into the wild to study the great apes. He sent Diane Fossey, of course, to study gorillas. He sent Jane Goodall to study chimpanzees, and he sent Baruti Galdikas to study orangutans. And it was something nobody had ever done before. She pioneered the whole study of orangutans in Borneo, and eventually went on to found an orphanage because she ran into a situation where there was all these orphaned orangutans continually being brought into her field station where she was doing her study, and she had to find a way to save them. So she switched a lot of her emphasis from studying them to actually raising them and releasing them. You know, my background, I'm a biologist by education. I did a master's degree in animal behavior at the University of Alberta. And on the way through studying biology, you hear about some of these stories and these people. Daphne Sheldrick is a story that's been ongoing for 50 years. There's been specials done on her. There was a CBS special, done 60-minute special that was done on her about 3 years ago. So I knew about her. And Baruti Galdikas is somebody that we all learn about in biology, and she's one of, like I said, the three Leakey ladies that went up to study the great apes. So there's stories that certain circles would know about, certainly anybody in biology. And the producer of the film, Drew Feldman, actually went to Borneo and saw Baruti's operation many years ago and decided at that point that it would be a great story for a film. So he brought the idea back to IMAX and Warner Brothers and convinced them to go forward with the film, and they called me because of my experience with great apes and IMAX, and that's how I got involved in the film. Both orphanages rely essentially on donations from patrons or from individuals who go online to the Sheldrick Trust or to orangutans.org, and they sign up to be an orphan parent. And essentially you can adopt one of the orphans, and you pay a certain amount every month or every year into the trust fund, and that goes to feed those animals and raise those animals. And that's how these operations work. They're basically trusts. They're charitable organizations that use all the money that comes in to basically raise and rehabilitate the animals. Well, it's like a lot of these trusts and charities. I mean, these two are founded on the personalities in some ways of Daphne Sheldrick in Africa and Baruti Galdikas in Borneo. And Daphne's organization has now got, her daughter now runs it. Angela runs the organization, and Angela's sons are actually quite keen on the organization. So I think there's going to be an ongoing legacy that'll happen with the elephant orphanage. In the case of the orangutans, it's a little less certain what's going to happen to that organization 20 years from now, when Baruti isn't able to be quite as active. I think she's trying to find someone that'll help her. One of her children, she has 3 kids, might actually pick up the reins and continue it on, but it's uncertain. And I think that kind of sums up both animals to me, is the elephants have a much better reputation, are much better known. There's a tourism industry in Kenya that's dependent on elephant viewing. In orangutan, it's a tougher place to get to where orangutans live. It's harder to see a wild orangutan than it is to see a wild elephant. And I think that the forests are disappearing so fast in Borneo and in Malaysia that it's hard to know how much longer there's going to be wild orangutans around, if it's 10, 20, 30 years. And so all the effort right now is going into trying to save the forests, trying to keep preserves and national parks going in these countries in order to have a place for wild orangutans to live. I mean, the goal, and hence the name of the film, Born to be Wild, the goal of these organizations and of these orphanages is not to keep these animals in captivity forever. What they want to do is to, you know, first of all, save the animal because it'll die if it doesn't get brought to the orphanage, and then basically rehabilitate it and get it ready to be a wild animal again. And that's a very difficult task when you've had an animal in captivity. So a lot of the emphasis on how they raise the animals, the elephants and the orangutans, is all geared toward how does this animal sustain itself in the wild in the future. And in the case of elephants, it's a bit of an easier task because elephants are animals that live in herds. So essentially you need to find a herd for the baby to enter at some point in its life when it gets old enough. And so there's a lot of herds out there. There's a lot of elephants that live in these national parks that some of them orphans themselves. The herds are made up of ex-orphans that have gone wild and also a mixture of wild animals. And so there's herds for these orphaned elephants when they get 10 or 12 years old to actually integrate into, and then they basically go off and become wild elephants and sometimes never have an interaction with humans again. In the case of orangutans, it's a little harder because orangutans are basically solitary family group animals. They don't live in large groups, they don't live in tribes. So to find a place to put a wild orphaned orangutan back into the wild when it's young is nearly impossible. I mean, there's no mother orangutan in the wild that's going to accept an orphan. She has enough time, a hard enough time looking after herself and her offspring. So what they do is they keep those orangutans until they're old enough to basically forage for themselves. So they need to be subadults, sometimes 10, 12 years old is a perfect age in a way because they can forage for food and they can make their way in the wild themselves. But it's a tough go because there's only so much forest that an orangutan can be released into. And after a while the forest becomes saturated and full of orangutans and there's, you know, not making new forest. So it's a harder situation to rehabilitate an orangutan, but when it works, these orangutans, and it does work often, they go off and then they have their own families in the wild, and those babies that they have in the wild have no contact with humans and are truly wild animals. Yeah, well, the orphans basically are orphaned because their mothers are poached or killed for various reasons. So that's why an elephant or an orangutan becomes an orphan, because mothers don't abandon their young. So if an elephant dies, a female elephant mother, or is poached for her ivory, then the baby's left behind, and that's how they end up in the orphanage. And in the case of orangutans, it's the forests that they live in that are cut down to be turned into palm oil plantations, or the logs used for buildings, you know, around the world. And that's the habitat of the orangutan. When you clear cut a forest, there's no place for an orangutan anymore. And so what happens is the mothers often will be shot by the loggers or will die in the course of the logging operation, and the tiny babies are brought into the local villages and then eventually make their way to the orphanage. Some of them, the lucky ones, make their way to the orphanage that's run by Baruti. I think this film works on all different levels. I've been in audiences that are 5 years old, and I've been in audiences that are 80 years old, and there's something in it for everybody. It's got bits of humor. You know, there's some touching moments in it. There's some informative moments, but it's meant to be accessible to everybody, and it's not. The language is simple enough that everybody will understand what's going on. The animals speak for themselves. They're cute. They're adorable. It's hard not to fall in love, no matter what age you are, with the elephants and the orangutans. So it's a true, what I call, you know, crossover film that crosses over the entire IMAX viewing audience. So no matter what age, I think you'll get something from this film.